Hey, hope you're doing well. I thought I'd try to make my video portrait instead of landscape for the month of November, just because it's a little more friendly, and I thought, why not try something new? So this is my November monthly newsletter. We're going to get into what I did in November and progress updates on all the projects. So let's get into it. So the first thing that happened in the month of November was I focused a lot on fall prevention. Let me actually switch to a loom so I can kind of walk you guys through what it is that I actually spent my time doing and walk you through some of the research that I did. What you see here is a Notion document that has all the factors for predicting a fall. So muscle strength, balance, cognition, gait, etc. These are all the predictors for falls that we identified, in the previous month. But in November, what we did was we focused on figuring out how to measure these in real time. That's the name of the document, measuring things in real time. So what I'll do is I'll quickly walk through each and every one of these metrics so you can see how it is that we're thinking about going about measuring each of these metrics. For muscle strength, we're specifically looking at grip strength, lower limb strength, and overall muscle mass. Grip strength can actually be measured by these little sensors that IBM's come up with that are literally just put on top of your fingernail. If I just open up this video, you can actually see right there that this is the sensor. It's just on the tip of your fingernail. That's one way to measure grip strength. But other than grip strength, we also need to measure lower limb strength. Lower limb strength can be measured using these things called inertial measurement units. So essentially what an IMU is, inertial measurement unit, is an accelerometer, which measures, how fast your hand is going, a gyroscope, which helps to measure angles, and then a magnetometer, which essentially is just measuring magnetic fields, so it knows the position you're in as well as the angle that you're in. And so it looks at all three of these things to be able to measure your lower limb strength. We could also measure overall muscle mass very simply by going through something called the Oxford scale, and they could do this at the start of the month rather than us doing this in real time, since you can't really measure muscle mass live in real time. Rather, we can measure the strength of specific things like, your hand or your lower limb. For balance, there's multiple different ways to do it, but specifically, we're looking at balance from the angle of your line of gravity and then your base of support. So we know that if your line of gravity, which is an imaginary line that goes from your center of gravity to the bottom of the floor, if that line is outside of your base of support, think of it like the area between your feet. If your line of gravity is outside of the base of your support, so if you're leaning too forward or you're leaning too backward, you're most likely going to fall. The way that we can measure your line of gravity is a couple of ways. We can use inertial sensors, things that I was talking about above, but on top of that, we can also use just very simple commercial accelerometers, very simple sensors on your back to look at your center of mass. So if I have a sensor at your lower back, I can see your center of mass because it's near to that area. And then if I see that that sensor is misaligned with your base of support, I can be able to tell, okay, you're not that balanced. So that's a few ways to measure balance in terms of line of gravity. In terms of base of support, it's really simple. There wasn't a lot online about this, but you could literally just look at a camera and just look at the position of the person's feet using pose detection, and then see the area of their 2 feet, or you could just have small sensors underneath the sole of the foot. So there's lots of different ways to measure base of support and line of gravity. For cognition, it's actually quite interesting. For cognition, I found this paper that said that they specifically measured your blood pressure as well as your heart rate and your heart rate variability. So you see this complicated table. On the left-hand side, it says sys BP, which is your systolic blood pressure. So when you get blood pressure, you get two different readings, systolic and diastolic. So we could look at those two things, and we could also look at your heart rate and how much that varies. So for example, if I'm focusing on a task and spending a lot of energy on it, my heart rate and blood pressure levels might increase because I might be spending extra energy on that task. And so that might be a really easy way for us to know how much cognitive effort someone's putting towards a task. In terms of gait, there's a lot of different methods. Image processing, just looking at a picture, floor-based sensors. Let me see if I can find a picture. There's one example right here where you walk on the floor, and based on the amount of force that you're putting on the ground, I can try to identify your gait. I can also look at sensors on the body, those inertial measurement units, looking at some of the same things like the magnetometers or the accelerometers. There's lots of ways to measure gait, but the main ways just come through image processing, like looking at pictures of that person walking, sensors on the body, or floor-based sensors. In terms of posture, we can look at similar things, right? Inertial measurement units, which are your accelerometers, as well as a flexible angular system. That's what it composes of. But on top of that, you could also just genuinely look at a camera. And then in the camera, you could see that person's pose by looking at where their hands are, where their feet are. And so that's one way to look at their posture. There's a ton of other factors. I won't go into all of them, like footwear, confidence in balance. A lot of them are very simple. You just ask somebody. You ask somebody how confident they are in their balance. You just look at the nutrition tracking system that some homes have. But for things like dehydration, you could also just have a wearable on, and based on the perspiration that you see from sweat on the wearable, you can see how dehydrated or how hydrated that person is. Things like location, those could be measured using Bluetooth beacons, very simple. The time of day, that's also really simple. You just look at the time. Walking aids, you just ask. Nocturnal toileting, you just look at the location of that person at a specific time. There's a ton of these. A lot of these are very, very simple to measure, so I won't go into all of them. The last few bits, previous falls, fear of falling, those are things that you just genuinely would ask the home. Like, does this person have a fear of falling? Has this person had any previous falls? There's actually already an assessment, and I'll talk about this later on in the newsletter, that people use to see if you have fallen or not. And so you could just look at that measurement. For medication, specifically, we're looking at if you either take more than 4 medications, because that highly affects your blood pressure, and then also if you take any of the following medications listed below, because all of these medications highly affect your blood pressure, and that highly affects your walking ability, etc. Vision and hearing, these are a little bit hard to measure. Vision, you could measure through some sort of wearable that might be able to look at the size of your pupils to see if you're squinting or not. And then with hearing, most likely this will be something that we measure on a standstill, so not in real time, but something that's similar to overall muscle mass. We use a scale to measure rather than measuring it in real time. So that's the first part of what we did for fall prevention. We figured out how at a high level we're going to be measuring each and every one of these metrics. The second thing that happened this month in regards to fall prevention was I met with John Hurdes. So he's a professor at Waterloo's Health Sciences, and he's essentially part of this team that every 3 months focuses on creating an assessment that all homes across Canada use to assess their seniors. The data from this is then put online, and it's really, really good for looking at full information, looking at the general health of the senior, conditions that they might have, etc. It's just general data that the government uses to analyze these homes. And his team is the one that creates these assessment tools in the first place. They actually also worked on creating a first time fall prediction algorithm for both home care and then also for long term care. And so, what I decided to do is from our meeting, he gave me these resources to look at on this first time fall algorithm. And so, what I did was I looked at what is it that they look at in these first time fall algorithms and this assessment that's already given to homes every 3 months. And is there any data in that they're looking at that we can add on to our current list? So I'll just walk through that right now on the loom. You should see me in the top right hand corner of your screen. The way I'm going to walk through this is I'm going to go over the algorithm. I'm going to explain the questions that they ask to try and predict a fall. And each question is associated with a point. And then based on the amount of points that you have, you're essentially put into like a fall risk. So 1 being the lowest fall risk, 5 being the highest fall risk. And then it was shown that those that had like the highest fall risk had a 30% chance of falling in the next 180 days. And so that's kind of how it looks at trying to prevent a fall. The questions that they ask are split into a few categories. They look at your age. You can see at the top right here. They look at your sex, if you're male or female, if you're living alone. They look at your daily activities. They look at how much help you need on a daily basis to do these activities. They look at your cognitive performance. They look at your bladder. They look at your gait level. They look at conditions or diseases that affect your mood, your ability to move around and do these activities. And then they obviously look at if you have cognitive disorders such as Alzheimer's or dementia. Now, each question is essentially given a point, but the way that it works is based on your answer to a question, it then sends you to the next question. It's called a decision tree. So they're essentially operating this based off of each question moving to another question. So if you say you have unsteady gait, then they'll ask you a specific question. But if you say you have a steady gait, they'll ask you a different question. Let me actually make this bigger so we can see it and kind of walk through it. You see right here that the very first thing that they ask is if you have an unsteady gait. And if you do have an unsteady gait, then they're going to ask about your cognitive performance. And so if you have cognitive performance issues, then based on that, they'll be like, okay, what's your level of Parkinson's? Is it 1 to 6, or do you not have Parkinson's at all? If you don't have Parkinson's at all, and in this case scenario, you're a 0, you move back. You move another level down to see what your sex is. If you're a male, you now move up to this section here where it looks at your last 7 days of your control of urine and your bladder. And if, it says that, you weren't really able to control your urine in the last 7 days, and there are more than 3 days in which you were not able to control your urine, it then gives you a fall risk of 5. I'll walk through one more. Very simply, it looks at primary motor locomotion indoors. Are you stable or not? If your rating is from 0 to 2, you move on to the next question, which is, do you have an unsteady gait? If you don't have an unsteady gait, it asks you if you're above 80 years old. If you are above 80 years old, it asks you questions regarding your cognition. If on the cognitive performance scale you rate like a above 1, your fall risk is 3. So that's kind of how it's done. It's a very simple decision tree. If we look at the results of the study, these are the results right here. We see that those in the fifth risk fall category, so I'm going to look at Ontario, in the fifth risk fall category, the positive predictive value, or the amount of times they were able to predict that you were going to fall correctly, was 30% of the time. So 30% of the time they were able to predict that you were going to fall correctly if you were in the fifth risk category and you lived in a long-term care home in Ontario. So that's kind of interesting. That's for the first time fall algorithm that John and his team worked on. For the current assessment method that's used in homes, it's called RAIMDS. And the questions that they ask for falls range. They look at if you wander, they look at balance problems, they look at your fall history, they look at things such as the amount of medications that you take, but specifically the things that I realized that we didn't look at, that I didn't have in the metrics before, was a few things. One, I never took into account your bladder and whether you can control your bladder or not. And that's apparently a factor for falls. I also didn't look at your living difficulty scale. And these are very simple. To figure this out, you could just ask about it in advance because they already measure this. This is data that they already have, that they already measure every 3 months. So the easiest way to find out about this information is ask about it, or if I really need to, just measure it in real time. Conditions like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and dementia, I didn't have that earlier, so we're going to add that to our list. I never looked at wandering earlier. An easy way to measure that is just by looking at the location of the senior, which can be told via Bluetooth beacons and a wearable. Anti-anxiety medication, I didn't have that on our list of medications, and so I added that. And then the last two things are restraint of your trunk. Your trunk is like lower limb areas, and it's saying that if you do have trunk restraints when getting out of bed or getting out of a chair, those also correlate to falls. So these are the main, things or metrics that I didn't look at before, that from reading the papers that John recommended, I'm now able to add to our list to see if we can, now be able to add more things to predict the fall. So now essentially I have more metrics to predict the fall thanks to John and all of his guidance and mentorship. So thank you so much to John and his team for making these and for, recommending these papers for me to look at. I do really appreciate it, and I'm definitely going to be using it going forward. Well, that's all from me for the month of November. I'll see you guys at the end of December, and hopefully I'll have something, physically to show you, because now that we've already found all the metrics, added a few metrics to our list, and then, also figured out how we're going to measure these metrics in real time. It's just about testing it out, creating the product, and then, getting home's thoughts on our product. So I guess we'll see, hopefully, if we can have something physically made by the end of December. See you guys.